So I'm Joy Vernon, and I'm the organizer for the Greater Seattle Tarot Meetup. The very first thing I'm going to say is that this very possibly will be mind melting, like Elizabeth said the cube of space was. I hope not. I hope it's more introductory, but we'll see. It's definitely me and my approach, which is not going to be typical. Along the same lines, if you're used to the typical, this is what Saturn means, this is what Neptune means, the last time they were conjoined in Aries was 1703, and these are all the wonderful historical events that happened at that time. I don't do that, and I really upset some guy in one of my meetups for not doing that. It's like, what people normally do is this, and I'm like, I know, I don't. Sorry about that. Sorry to disappoint. So if you're like super excited for history, you've come to the wrong place. So those are a few caveats. That said, this is going to be a deep dive, which is appropriate for the symbolism that we're doing. And so please stay with me. Please hang out, and we're going to get started with this. All right, so I'm going to introduce a variety of symbolism. First of all, we'll look at some tarot symbolism and some astrology. Then I'm going to look at the cube of space and a little bit of Kabbalistic symbolism as well. Those go hand in hand, and some alchemy. And that's going to be kind of a quick surface glide across those things that each one alone could be very deep, but we're going to kind of touch the surface of it. And then the stories are going to come into play, and we've got three of them. We're looking at Beowulf, the Fisher King, and then Nicodemus. And if you go to church, to a liturgical church, Nicodemus was the sermon or the gospel that was read, and usually the sermon is on the gospel, but it was the gospel that was read 2 weeks ago. Well, I'll do I'm not an expert on any of these stories either, but just like I'm not great at history stuff, but I understand literature a little bit better than I understand history. So it's going to be a very brief summary of each story, and then we're going to discuss it in terms of the Saturn and Neptune and Aries and Pisces types of symbolism. And so we've got 3 to get through, which is kind of a lot. So we'll see what happens, and then we'll conclude by kind of like what symbolism what symbolism that we discussed, how does that apply to your own life is kind of what the conclusion is going to be. So getting started here, these are the tarot cards that are associated with Saturn and Neptune. We've got the World card for Saturn, and we've got the Hanged Man for Neptune. And a lot of people notice when they start off working with the tarot that the positioning of the legs, for instance, is very similar. The fact that there's kind of a triangular quality with the arms, in this case it's kind of the elbows and the head, there's a certain similarity between the two cards, and yet an inversion. And as I said in the write-up for the event, I've also learned that the Hanged Man is symbolic of the baby turning in the womb to get ready to be born. And the symbolism of the wreath in the World card is that vaginal canal. And so the dancer in the world stepping through that wreath is symbolic of something coming into being, or something being manifested, or of course something being born. And so that's a lot of the symbolism just starting out. Saturn and Neptune, might not be associated with babies. That's a typical thing, but we're gonna explore this and see how this comes together. So then Pisces and Aries, and Pisces is the moon card and Aries is the emperor. And the moon card, the just looking at the two of these, you can see a lot of the difference between Pisces and Aries. This path just goes on and on and on without an end. And that is such a Piscean thing, that there is no boundary. Whereas the Emperor is just front and center, very squared off, you know, all these rectangles, all this gray stone. There's a lot of structure to him. And those are some of the contrasting energies that we're looking at. Although in some ways the stone energy is a Saturnian energy. And so it can even some of the symbolism we're already seeing, even though this is Aries, the Emperor as a leader is more of the Aries thing. The Emperor as kind of a self-sufficiency is a good Aries term that also applies to the Emperor. There's a very strong sense of self-control, self-sufficiency that goes with both of those. There's even with the water, there's a sense of immersion in the moon card and in the energy of Pisces. And I don't want to go too much into any one of these. We could go down rabbit holes with each one, but we've got an agenda to stick to. So we've got Saturn and Neptune cycle. So Saturn and Neptune meet once every 36 years. And that's basically, and how the cycle works is that two planets will conjoin, and in this case, they last conjoined in Capricorn in 1989 to 90-ish. I don't know. I think there was one of those. I think that was one where there was the three. Usually there's three conjunctions due to a retrograde. And that's not the case this time in 2020. Whenever it happens, 2026, I think, is when February 2026, I think, is when this conjunction is going to happen, coming up at the first degree of Aries. Their retrogrades will all be over by then. And so there's not a set of three, there's only one, and it happens right there at 0 degrees Aries. But basically two planets will be together, and then they both start moving forward. Now Saturn's going to take about 30 years to go around that whole chart, but meanwhile Neptune's moved forward a little, so then it'll take a little bit longer for Saturn to then catch up to Neptune. So 36 years is the total time that it takes for those two to for Saturn to go all the way around and catch up to Neptune again. And that's called a synodic cycle. So the last time it happened was in Capricorn, 1989, 90. You can think about what you were doing then. That was in the sign of Capricorn. Now we're going to be a square away into the sign of Aries. They meet in the same sign approximately once every 320 years, which I did by pulling up a bunch of Saturn and Neptune conjunctions and calculating it. So I think I got it right. And then the last time they met in Aries was in 1703. Previously to that was 1380, 555 Common Era, 232 Common Era. I didn't go back earlier than that, but those are some examples. So you can see, even though they typically come together once every 223 years, they don't always, it's not like predictable that they're always coming together in Aries every 323 years. You know, sometimes they can't come together, you know, in the sign earlier or the sign later. It's not quite as, I don't know, it's not quite as predictable or symmetrical as some when we saw, what was it Jupiter and Neptune that when we did Drowned in Sleep? For Jupiter and Neptune, we saw that they came together like clockwork, just like every whatever their cycle is, they came together like clockwork, and it was very predictable, always in the subsequent sign. That's not quite the case here, and again, that's kind of some of our Saturn and Neptune, not necessarily, they're so different, and so there's almost a struggle in when are we going to come together again. How is that going to manifest? So they're going to, Saturn and Neptune are going to be together basically over the course of 5 years in the same sign. I mapped the whole thing out, but it was way too much info. So I saw that somebody else on some website had summarized it, and I thought that was a good idea. I copied what they had and then adjusted it to the notes I had taken, because we weren't 100% in agreement. So I don't know. I'm not promising that any of my I'm not promising anything's correct. I tried to be very detailed in how I was doing it. So I felt like I was doing a good job. So I did adjust this to match up with the dates that I had established, but they'll both be in Pisces for these 2 years. And then there'll be a point where one moves ahead into Aries, and there's these retrogrades that go into play. There's a lot of weird things about what goes into play, but they'll both be together in Aries from May through August. That's the one I changed. I think the person I had looked at had said September, and I didn't see it. I saw August. And then they're back into Pisces together, both of them retrograde for part of it, this October 2025 to January 2026, and then finally coming into Aries, and that's when they have their conjunction, is in February of 2026, and then they're in there together at that point until Saturn finally leaves Aries in April of 2028, and then of course Neptune will stay there for a little while longer. This outlines their co-presence when they're both in the same sign, not when they're conjunct. There's only the one time that they actually perfect that conjunction. However, it's very interesting that there's a time of really about 8 to 9 months, like 38 weeks, that they are within 1 degree most of the time, and then probably, I didn't look at every single day within that time, but I would say probably within 3 degrees at the most, as they kind of retrograded at different speeds and things like that. But there's a good almost 9 months that they're together within, I'm going to say less than 3 degrees, maybe. So yeah, so some very, very interesting things that they're spending a lot of time together this go around. So now let's take a look, now that we've got kind of a little bit of this is what's going on in the heavens. Now let's take that and look into some of the symbolism. And one of the main things that I learned, and we did a whole series on the cube of space in, let's see, it's 20, so in 2021, we did an entire series on the cube of space following David Hulse's model. And then in 2022, we did a year in the cube of space following Kevin Townley's work. And so Kevin Townley, at the end of his book, Cube of Space, the container for creation, or something like that, he mentioned that, and Kevin Townley also has an innovation that he added. Each of the 22 Hebrew letters are placed on the cube according to the Sefer Yetzirah, which is one of the classic texts of Jewish Qabalah. And then Paul Foster Case, not all 22 of them, the 3 mother letters are left out. So Paul Foster Case theorized and said, well, what if we give those 3 mother letters, which is the it's the Fool card here, which is the vertical axis, the Hanged Man, which is the east to west axis, and the Judgment card, which is the north to south axis. What if we put those 3 mother letters in the center like this as these 3 primary axes? And Sefer Yetzirah talks about dimensions and extensions, and it just doesn't say that the three mother letters go there, but it's kind of it's a pretty good leap to put them there. And so then Kevin Townley comes along and he's like, well, what about the final letters? Because in Hebrew, there are an additional 5 letters that are final forms of letters. And so he applies them to 4 of the 5, get these diagonal. So I'm like, what is the word for an X? They get these diagonals in here. And there's one from I forget them. Which one goes where. I was having trouble remembering that, but anyway, the four of the 5 finals get the diagonals, and then he puts the final mem sophit here in the center with the world card. Now, we already talked about the Hanged Man and the world, and that there is some birth symbolism there already. And the thing is, in the David Hulse's version of the Cube of Space, he talks about the Hanged Man. The Hanged Man is mem, the letter mem, and the number for mem is 40. 40 weeks is a number of weeks of gestation, and the Hanged Man is Neptune. And he symbolizes this axis that goes from the Empress card in the east to the Wheel of Fortune in the west. And so Hulse describes this as the birth process from the womb of the Empress through the world, where it gains, where it becomes clothed in its personality, and then born into the world, into manifestation, into life, with the Wheel of Fortune card. So we already have that symbolism in the Cube of Space for the Hanged Man, but then Townley adds it over top of the world card at the center. So, and here's a little bit clearer illustration of the 3 axes, the vertical with the Fool, and the north-south with the Judgment, and the Hanged Man from the east to the west. So at the center with mem, the letter mem, and the world's letter tav, there are 2 Hebrew words that are spelled that way, mem tav, or another word, tav mem. Mem tav is met, which means death, and or dead. And this morning I was double checking the transliteration. I know it's like Hebrew is complicated. You can't anticipate what a transliteration is out of the Hebrew letters into English letters. And so I thought I'd seen it met M-E-T before, but I wanted to check that it wasn't an E that they put in, that it's T and not TH, which it could be either one actually. But anyway, I asked Hal this morning, I said, I was trying to find it in Strong's Concordance and I couldn't, because I was looking for the wrong word. I think I was looking for death or dead, which the mem tav version of that apparently doesn't show up in the Bible. A different version of that word shows up. But Hal grabbed his actual physical copy of Strong's Concordance and looked up mem tav for me. And in the Bible, that word does show up, but it means male. And I thought that was very interesting, and you will see why when we get to the stories. Now, when you switch those letters around, so death is 1, but the other version, tav mem, means perfection, end, or completion. And so it does also have a sense of conclusion to it, but the idea of perfection or even integrity is a lot of what that word means. And so we've got this sense of, and and most authors on the cube of space describe the world card, and of course with Townley, the world card and the hanged man, as being the center of the cube is both the beginning and the end of the evolutionary cycle. And so there's that. I'm not going to go into any more cube of space. That's enough for you right now. When we're looking at alchemy, to go from Pisces into Aries, and you can read my most recent blog post is on calcination, and I do talk about how the Thema Mundi is used as a structure to outline the 7 alchemical stages. There can be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 12. There's a whole variety of numbers of stages in alchemy, but 7 and 3, 7 or 12 are kind of the most common. And in our first Saturday of the month, we're series this year on alchemy, we're working with the 7 stages. And the Splendor Solace, which is the meetup I'm leading on the second Saturday of the month, also works with the 7 stages. And going from Pisces into Aries, or from Jupiter into Mars, is the movement from dissolution into separation. And you can see the illustration here. In fact, it made me think of the Olympics because of the 3 here, and they've got little crowns on their heads and they look very happy, and it's just like 1, 2, and 3. It's like first place, like what is that? It's gold, silver, and bronze. They won the medals. But when you're in the middle of doing your competition for the Olympics, this is what it feels like. You're in a ball, you're in a mess, whether you're directly competing in some kind of actual grappling or fight of some kind, or whether even if you're competing like ice skating or something where you're working individually but being judged against other people, it still feels like you're in this muddle that you can't see anything. What's going on, how am I doing? But at the same time, that can be a very Pisces thing to not have clarity around what's going on. At the same time, if you are really in the zone, that can also be a very Piscean thing of I'm just like at one with my craft, I'm just doing my performance, I'm doing my art, and I am doing the best that I possibly can. That's also a really good description of dissolution or of the Piscean energy. And it's only after the fray that we come out with clarity around what happened during, what's the outcome of that fray. We've got separate, this one's good for this one did this well, this one did this well. It gets separated out, and we see clearly what each can accomplish. So now we're going to go into our stories. When I originally started planning this in my mind several months ago, I actually didn't think of Beowulf right away. I thought of the Fisher King, which we're also going to look at, as being a very Piscean, Aryan combo type of energy. But Beowulf came up when I wrote if you guys, anybody that kind of noticed, I usually try to write up my event description several weeks ahead of time, but I just couldn't get around to doing the write-up for this one, and literally did it like 2 or 3 days ago. And when I was writing that up, I suddenly the words from Yeats's Second Coming were going through my mind. And I morphed it a little bit and rewrote it in my own words and said, what great beast sloughs off the primal seas to emerge in a new evolution, and to emerge onto dry land in a new evolution, or something like that. And and I was like, I've got a really strong sense that there's a story there but I can't think what it is. And it's like, oh, right, Beowulf has that mother, the mother of Grendel down in the deep. That's the energy I'm going for. It could be any kind of even 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and the giant squid or whatever that was. That can be that energy. Certainly, I think haven't ever read this, but I believe the Cthulhu energies are very similar, very chthonic and underwater. In Beowulf, basically, there was this very destructive monster who was attacking this kingdom. And Beowulf, interestingly, takes place. The setting is the 6th century, and one of our Saturn-Neptune Aries conjunctions was in the 6th century. But they're not really clear on this, and that's the setting of this. I heard generally that it was probably written in the 8th century. So anyway, I don't have very good dates on this, and it sounded like nobody does. So there's this destructive monster who is attacking this castle of this king, Hrogoth or something like that. And Beowulf is this young man. He comes up and he pledges his service to the king, and says, me and my guys will come in tonight and we will be rowdy and loud and draw the attention of the monster. He'll come in to attack us, and then we will get him for you. And the king is like, go for it. And so it turns out that when the monster shows up, the swords won't pierce his skin. But I think perhaps Beowulf had already decided he wanted to fight him hand to hand anyway. And so he kills the monster by ripping its arm off. And he does it hand to hand without a weapon. And so the monster slinks off and goes back home to die. Well, it lives in this kind of cursed lake. And so then there is this chthonic mother, the mother of the beast, lives in this lake, and she comes out to avenge her son. And I obviously skipped a whole bunch, but basically she comes back, she kills some people, so Beowulf has to go after her, and he dives down, and that's what this is. He dives down into the sea, and she is trying to hold on to him to squeeze him, and his armor protects him from her squeezing him to death. And then they dive down past all these wonderful eerie, I love these eerie sea creatures and everything. That's her right there. They end up at a dry cave, because it takes him hours to get down there, apparently, and I don't know how he holds his breath that long, but he does. And they end up at a dry cave, and he can fight her. And but of course she's very strong, and eventually he brings a sword with him, but it doesn't work on her, just like it didn't work on her son. But then he sees a great sword on the wall in her cavern, and he takes that and is able to behead her and destroy her. And then Grendel, her son, had wandered back to that cavern to die, and he was dead, but Beowulf takes his head off as well. I think it's interesting that Aries is the head and Pisces is the sea, but we'll get into the symbolism in a minute. He then, after he beheads the mother, he beheads the dead body of Grendel so he can take that head back as a trophy. But when he does it, Grendel's blood dissolves the sword. There's a second part to the story. 50 years later, Beowulf is king and there has been peace. he's an old man now. One of his slaves steals a golden cup from a dragon, and so as a result, the dragon attacks Beowulf's castle. Beowulf kills the dragon in its lair, but he's bit on the neck, and the dragon's teeth are venomous. They have venom, and so he ends up dying. But it is an act of self-sacrifice. He's got an extensive army. They ended up fleeing. They all went, but they ended up fleeing except for one friend. But it is both examples of him entering into a situation that might involve sacrifice, both with Grendel and then with the dragon that does actually culminate in self-sacrifice. So that's the story. So exploring the symbolism of Beowulf, I think the idea of the monster and the destruction and certainly the sinking into the sea is that sense of Pisces. The dissolution, the death, all of that is kind of Pisces energies and dissolution, destruction and dissolution, I think can work together. The fact that well, I mentioned two things here, that he's a young hero at one point. I think that's a little more of an Aries symbolism. But then the Pisces is this idea of service or altruism. I called it a unification of need. Pisces to me is merging everything together. Everything dissolves into Pisces. And so when he sees that the king is having a problem, he's like, your problem is my problem. I want to come and help. Whereas the hand-to-hand combat is very Aries. The phonic mother, the underworld, and even symbols of gestation are all Piscean symbols. And then, of course, there is the magic sword, which can be an Aries symbol because it's ruled by Mars, the warrior, whose symbol is a sword. But interestingly, Saturn uses a scythe, and that's also a symbol of death and ending. So either one of those could be relevant. Of course, the next part of the story takes place 50 years later, and so now we have an old hero, and that could even be Saturn in Pisces. Saturn is known as the old man, the Senex, and that's part of his symbolism. Interestingly, Neptune the energy of Pisces feels the most ancient to me. I feel like Pisces energy is very ancient. Of course, symbolically, Neptune Neptune moves very slowly. It takes, I think, 14 years to go through a sign. And so in that sense, Neptune seems older and slower and kind of wiser than Saturn. Saturn feels young and brash compared to Neptune when we look at the time they take to go through a sign. However, in mythology, keep in mind that it's Uranus that's the father of Saturn, and Neptune is actually one of his sons. Neptune and Jupiter are brothers. So there's a little bit, that's a little bit of a chin scratcher for me, because I'm like, the symbolism doesn't always line up, but that's just one of those weird breaks that you get with symbolism. So the old hero, some of the Pisces energy, maybe the Saturn energy, even the fact that Neptune moves more slowly than Saturn, any of those things could kind of come up. Then there's the golden cup that the slave steals from the dragon. And this is very similar to the Grail myth that we're also going to be looking at with the Fisher King. And the spirituality of that is certainly a Piscean thing. That's a court, well, it depends on who you read, but that cup, not this cup here, but the Grail itself was the cup that caught the blood of Christ when he was on the cross, and they used the lance to pierce his side. Not trying to do Easter stuff at Easter. Saturn just moved into to this stuff. So there you have it. Saturn is trying to they're really, Saturn in Pisces is like Lent, and Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries is like Easter Day. But the gold of the cup is, even alchemically, gold is the sun. It's the final coagulation. It's the ultimate goal. And so we even have some of this stuff going on. The fire-breathing dragon is certainly very Aries energy. There's that deadly fight. Again, Aries is ruled by Mars, the warrior. And even the idea of the Aries Pisces cusp itself could be the sense of self-sacrifice that Beowulf exhibits. And so that was my take. I'm going to stop for a second and see, do any of you guys have any thoughts on this, or symbolism that's kind of popping out for you that you want to talk about?
When you were talking about Beowulf and the fight with the mother, if I seem to remember correctly, there was before they went into the water, there's this huge speech that the mother gives where you kind of understand her point of view on why she's seeking vengeance and why Beowulf can't, there's like an impasse there almost. And then they go into the water and there's this huge fight, and like it's the depths and the deep down. And that, to me, Beowulf could be the symbolism for Saturn, and Neptune could be like the kind of dissolution of the mother. And then in Pisces, rolling around in the depths of the sea, going deeper and deeper and deeper, with all the monsters coming and the lengths and the and the constriction of Saturn's being constricted and grabbed, and he feels very confined, but he's in a vast underwater world that he doesn't like. There's a real what's the word I'm looking for? It's Pisces. I don't even know what to
tell me about it, Natalie.
Neptune. There's a real like mysticism, or like overwhelming, dissolution towards the depths of the sea. So that symbolism can be, Saturn, the constriction, that fight scene, when you were talking about it, really kind of, if I remember the story, because it's been many, many, many years since I've read it, but I do remember thinking the symbolism really matches pretty well with this. So
nice.
And
the other thing before we go on, and we'll have a chance to discuss each story for a little bit. Before we go on to the next story, I'm going to ask you to just think for 30 seconds here. Think about this story and the symbolism that's come up, anything that's kind of rattling around in your brain. And is this applying to your life right now? Is there any part of this that you would like to engage, that you really want to have more part of your life? Kind of think about that for a few seconds, and jot any thoughts you have down so that you can come back to it. Yeah, Elizabeth.
I was thinking of the eye for an eye element to the story. I mean, he killed her son. And if I was on the jury in present day, I wouldn't send her to jail, even if she held him in a closet for a week, that kind of thing. But I very much that mentality of eye for an eye. So
these stories, they appeal to different things and different people through different cultures and through different time periods. And I'm with you. But of course, a lot of the traditional interpretations are obviously Grendel and the mother are bad, they're evil. Obviously Beowulf is good, and this is a good old-fashioned good over evil. I'm like, I don't think it's that simple. I think it's much more complicated.
So I've heard that the mother and Beowulf are the parents of Grendel. So that's the one thing. So it's actually he sacrifices his son and then gets sacrificed himself. And the key, I think, a lot of it, and then is that he goes back to his kingdom, right? And then he goes to defend the knight that the guy that stole the Grail. So there's a sacrifice again. It's kind of like everybody's sacrifice. So it fits me that it's the Hanged Man. It kind of brings back the whole story of the other great sacrificial king of this time period is Odin, right? The
Yes.
stories of Odin are floating around at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they're both represented very well in the Hanged Man, the sacrifice.
Yes. Yeah.
In modern times, we've kind of like pushed away the whole sacrificial factor of the Hanged Man and made it this rebirth and this noble kind of thing, but it may not be so much so.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I tend to like older traditional meanings a lot of the time. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and go back to the slideshow, and we'll take a look at our next story. So our second story is the Fisher King. The Fisher King, like I said, when I was like, I wonder if there's a story about an old man and the Piscean energy. And it's like, oh, the Fisher King. It just came to me right away. And so I had to look some of it up. I'm not nearly as well versed as I should be in the Arthurian legends, but basically the story goes that there is this ancient king. And I did, by the way, sometimes when I've talked about this in the recent past, people bring up the Wagner, and I did watch it, but it's got some differences. So I'm sticking to the original, the Chrétien de Troyes, which was written in the late 12th century. Again, it was written about, I think there was a Saturn-Neptune. There were a lot of Saturn-Neptune aspects, particularly squares, oppositions, the quarter points of the cycle that matched up with dates of the development of this story. I've got a whole bunch of notes on this. It's very interesting. But at any rate, it was the Chrétien de Troyes was written, they think, right before his death, like maybe 1180 to 1190 or something like that. And so there's this ancient king that lives in this castle. And the hero is Percival, young man, and he kind of stumbles onto it accidentally. But he's welcomed to the castle, and this is typical of most of the stories from that genre. He's welcomed to the castle, and there's a big feast, and there's a grail procession where they parade, they bring out the grail and parade it past the people at the feast. And it's very interesting. The hero has the capacity to heal. He does not know this, but he doesn't heal. And the trick is he is supposed to ask questions about the grail. Ironically, his mother had told him before he left, she's like, please be polite. Don't be questioning everybody all the time. Don't talk too much. Be nice. Make me proud. And so even though here was an opportunity to ask these questions, he kept silent. And if he had asked the right question, he would have been able to heal the Fisher King. And this ancient king is considered to be bedridden. The only reference to the fishing thing is that he goes out. I don't know if I even wrote it into the notes here, that he's too wounded to ride a horse, but he can go out in a boat and fish with a hook, which is interesting in and of itself, because the fish hook is Sadi, which is the star card, which Crowley puts to the emperor, and the death card is Nun, which is the fish. And of course, you know, we still get like the idea of going out onto water, which still gives us kind of some Piscean energy to it. And Paul Foster Case talks about the idea of angling or fishing with a hook as being a metaphor for, Paul Foster Case does, and I'm pretty sure that Joseph Campbell talks about the same metaphor, fishing as a metaphor for meditation, and meditation is a very Piscean thing. Anyway, I'm not supposed to talk about the symbolism. I'm just supposed to tell the story, but I can't help it. So anyway, that's the Fisher part of the Fisher King. So, and what had happened, of course, is that when Percival left his mother, she didn't want him to leave, and she actually died of abandonment. Now, the Fisher King had a wound in his thighs or his legs. The land of his kingdom was barren. And you can even see that a little bit in this. This looks like water to me, but you can see just dirt, trees without leaves. It really is. There's a golden quality to the castle, which is very suggestive. The Grail, of course, again, being that golden cup and the ultimate solar final step of alchemy, the solar gold, the great work, achieving the great work. So there's a little bit of that, and that even this thing up here is like an inverted cup. I mean, it's a very interesting illustration. And so the king is wounded and the land is barren. The story says that Percival has to two steps. First of all, he has to become the best knight he can be in the world, and then he has to give that up and abandon worldly pursuits and seek the spiritual. There's a number. Detroit died, I believe, while writing this story, like possibly literally, like it. If I understood what I read right, like in the middle of a sentence, it left off and he was dead or something like that. I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's what it sounded like, whatever I read. But then there are these subsequent continuations. There's several continuations of the story picked up by other authors. And so they get more complicated and bring in all kinds of additional tasks that Percival has to do. And I think one of those tasks on the continuations is the idea that he has to go out and become the best knight he can be and all of this stuff. But then he also has to, again, after he achieves worldly fame, then he has to abandon it all and achieve these spiritual pursuits. The last continuation takes a sharp turn. And again, I wrote down dates. I will show them to anybody that's interested, that seem to really address the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions ending in a Saturn-Neptune in, I believe, in Aries conjunction, that was very interestingly close to the last continuation, when the story takes this very sharp turn into vengeance and violence. And in that version, it's like the Percival's job is not spiritual at all. His job is entirely to seek vengeance on the king of whoever had. It was a whole different version. Like somebody had hurt the king, and Percival was supposed to have vengeance on them. And then there was this in one version, and then there's this other version where there was this entire bloody, violent war that had to be fought. And of course, I was so fascinated by the Fisher King idea, and this is what always happens with those Arthurian romances, is that you're really interested in one kind of metaphor, and then they're constantly dropping the ball. That's my problem with Arthurian romances. They're always dropping the ball, and I'm like, wait, whatever happened to that story? I wanted more on that one, but you go off and tell me this other one instead. And so and of course that's what I was saying. I was very disappointed. I'm like, this is the result. I mean, this is a spiritual quest and it ends with this bloody war. This is very disappointing. And then it was like, oh, that's Pisces into Aries. And that is the ongoing interplay of those two planets in Pisces, and they don't conjoin until Aries. And I was like, oh wow. And it's like, does that create a prediction? I have no idea. So I wasn't able to pursue this. Was not able to pursue this for several weeks after that, trying to figure out what I thought about that. So here, if I can get this to, there we go. Okay, so here's my symbolism for the Fisher King. Saturn, the old man, the king, and I talked a little bit about the Pisces, fishing and the idea of fishing or meditating, that kind of stuff. Aries and Mars is the young man. The Pisces visions and fantasies, the feast and the Grail procession, all of the next morning, partly because he doesn't ask those questions, which apparently are, who does the Grail serve and what is the meaning of the bleeding lance? So those are the questions that you're supposed to ask the Grail, or ask about the Grail. I'm not quite sure how that plays out, but it's who does the Grail serve and what is the meaning of the bleeding lance? Again, I did not read Chrétien de Troyes. I just read, I will confess, I just read a summary by somebody that looked like they knew what they were talking about. Okay, so if he had asked those questions, I think he would have saved like the whole castle and the king and the whole land, the whole kingdom. But all the people disappear the next day. And so this was like a fantasy or a vision or something. Maybe it was a reality that he failed to shift into. Maybe, I'm not sure what all that means. But very Piscean, absolutely. Pisces as healing, but also Pisces and Neptune as lack of awareness of ability. I think there's the fact that Percival has that ability to heal. He has that Piscean ability, but is unaware of it. Saturn and Pisces, the tarot card, Eight of Cups, Saturn and Pisces is called abandoned success. And that's a lot of our initial, and that's where Saturn is right now in that first decan of Pisces. And a lot of that is the energy that's going on right now. And of course, one of the main symbols of characterization for Percival is that he abandoned his mother and she died as a result of that abandonment. The Pisces Aries cusp again, is it Pisces? Is it Aries? Is it the spiritual? Is it the warrior? Wounded in the thighs, and that's a symbol of impotence, and the barren land as a result, that Gaia, the Mother Earth, has not been fructified and cannot produce the things that she produced, plants and animals and whatnot. And I think the wound in the thighs, the impotence, I think that plays out heavily throughout the stories that I chose. The sword dissolving. Swords are phallic symbols, and so they frequently represent not just power and male power as a expression of at least in the time I picked really old stuff, as you guys can see. I like old stuff. It was swords were more associated with men than women, but even in slang, in the word sword is Zion in Hebrew. It matches up with the lover's card. And the Zion is Hebrew slang for penis. It means like dick. They say, there's an idiomatic phrase. If you do something really stupid, make a stupid mistake, you say Zion Bayan, which means dick in the eye. And so, so Zion is penis, and so the sword is definitely a phallic symbol, and whether it can be used properly, what happens to it after it's used, you know, those things are all very relevant to this, I think. And that's why I was saying I had known that mem tav at the center of the cube meant death. I had always heard that, always read that, but the fact that I just discovered literally this morning that in the Bible, mem tav actually means male. And it's like, very, very interesting. So the idea that the hero is being asked not to move forward into Aries, but to stay in Pisces by the original story, that he's actually prevented from moving forward and is asked to stay in this very spiritual level. And yet, at the same time, the story doesn't resolve. And the continuations seem to somehow predict this necessary step forward out of the spiritual sign of Pisces into Aries, the sign of the warrior. So that's my take on the Fisher King. I'm going to invite you guys, as I did before, to think about this Fisher King story, think about some of the symbolism that we discussed, and think, how does this apply to your life? You know, especially like the thing that like disturbed me to such a great degree when I read this was the fact that if he became very spiritual, he got stuck in Pisces and didn't advance into that birth in Aries. But the way the story goes, in order to be born into Aries, he had to learn how to use the sword, literally and figuratively and personally and culturally, everything, anatomically, and all of those things. And so there's a great deal of mother and son energy, I think, coming out. And also spirituality and war and religion and war energies coming out. The ruler of Pisces, traditional ruler, is Jupiter, who is associated with the priest or cleric or something. So to me, it's very complicated, very difficult symbolism, and hopefully going on to the next story will give some more depth to that. But think about it for a second, jot down any things that affected you or that you felt were really relevant either to yourself or energies that you want to work on and develop. Okay, the double Mars energy. I wanted to address that. I talked about the Eight of Cups, which is Saturn ruling the first decan of Pisces. And that's what we're in right now. Saturn is in the first decan of Pisces right now. And I put up on the meetup page, on the event page, I put my discussions, my articles that I've written on the three decans of Pisces. I don't know if I wrote the Aries ones or not. I might have. You can search. I don't have all of them done, but I have more than half of the decans written. I've been working on this since 2012. I've been trying to do it when the planet is in the decan, not just when the sun's in the decan. And it's just kind of like, that was a bad plan, Joy. Anyway, it's been taking a while, but you can check my site for pips and decans, the pips and decans series. And so Saturn rules the first decan of Pisces, and then Jupiter rules the second decan of Pisces, and Mars rules the third decan. And these three, like I said, I did post the links to those 3 articles. And then Mars also rules the first decan of Aries. And this is the one spot. Now, of course, remember that there are 2 sets of decan rulers. There's the triplicity rulers, which are more commonly learned by astrologers, but there is also the Chaldean rulers, which is more commonly used in esotericism, because the Chaldean rulers follow the Chaldean order of the planets, which is slowest to fastest: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. And those planets, those 7, are assigned to the decans starting it actually starts in Leo, in the first decan of Leo, with Saturn ruling that. It's a reference to the heliacal rising of Sirius and the flooding of the Nile and all that kind of stuff. And so it starts there technically, but if you start it in Aries, it starts with Mars, and then it goes all the way around and ends with Mars at the last decan of Pisces, if you do them in order that way. Either way you look at it, there's 2 decans in a row that end up being ruled by Mars, and it is the final decan of Pisces and the first decan of Aries. So we've got a double dose of Mars with all of our discussion of male energy and the sword and all of that stuff. And so there's an extra emphasis on the warrior quality, but generally what I've always learned is that this time of year, we are in the last decan of Pisces right now, and I guess we move in Monday into the first decan of Aries, that this time of year you need extra heat to thaw the frozen ground so that the plants can start to bud. And so just more heat is needed this time of year to transition from winter into spring. And that's the time that we're in right now. So then the first the decans of Aries, using the Chaldean order, are Mars ruled, Sun ruled, and Venus ruled. And so it goes Saturn, Jupiter, just goes right in order. We don't Mercury and the Moon go into the first 2 decans of Taurus, but it goes Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, another Mars, then the Sun, then Venus, and then the first decan of Taurus, the 5 of coins. I've got that article posted. That's Mercury, and then the 6 of coins, which I also have posted. That's a moon in the second decan of Taurus. So the last story is Nicodemus. And like I said, I haven't been to church in, I don't know, years, and Hal likes to go to church, but I teach on Sunday mornings, and I have a lot of ways of engaging my spirituality without going to church. And Hal, 2 weeks ago, Hal was like, hey, do you want to go to church? And I wasn't teaching that morning. I told him that, and he's like, let's go to church. And I was like, I couldn't think of a good excuse, so we had to go. And so the gospel that day was on Nicodemus. And last night, literally, I was putting together all my materials, and all of a sudden I'm like, you know what works here? Nicodemus. I'm adding Nicodemus into the mix. So it's in the gospel. Yeah, it's in the Gospel of John, and I didn't write that down up here, but I marked it here. It's in the Gospel of John, verses 1 through 19 or something like that. So Nicodemus goes during the night, kind of stealthily. He doesn't want anybody to know. He's embarrassed that he has these questions or whatever, but he goes at night to see Jesus teaching, and he says, he sees Jesus and says, God must be with you. God must be, or observes, I forget the exact phrasing. He just observes maybe to himself, God must be with him. And so that to me is an interesting thing just to ponder. Like, what does that say? How did he know that? What does that mean? And Jesus says to him, he says out loud, God must be with you, because Jesus replies, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again. And Nicodemus says, how can a man be born when he is old? Must he crawl back into his mother's womb? And I remember being a little kid in church and hearing that one and just, snickering. That's funny. And Jesus says, truly, truly, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless he is born of water and the Spirit. And then that's followed pretty closely on with one of the primary quotes that you'll hear from the Bible. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And anybody that knows the Bible recognizes that I use two different translations for this. I believe this was the Berean Study Bible, which my online source pulled up as a default, and this one is the King James, just because that was the one I was familiar with. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And I think this gets into the idea of what does that Pisces Aries cusp represent. He goes on to say that Christ came not to condemn the world, but to save it. And but when I say he now, I think I mean John. John goes on to say that Christ did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. And then there's this whole section on coming into the light, and battling the darkness type of thing. Which again, there can be judgmental stuff with that, but it is typically a Christian theme. So the idea of not condemning but saving, and battling darkness and coming into light. And so, I will also say, I apologize anybody that's like a recovering Catholic or that is very opposed to Christianity. I like it for the stories. I just like it for the stories, and well, more than that, but hopefully I am able to present this in a way that is interesting to anybody, and that is and not about religion, but about symbolism. So Jesus, of course, is associated with the age of Pisces. The age of Pisces started at the birth of Christ. And the idea of God being with Jesus that Nicodemus first mentioned, I think that's the idea of spirit being immanent in the world. And typically, when we're talking alchemical symbolism or elemental symbolism, spirit is typically expressed as fire. There's definitely arguments about that, but that's the most common, I think. And of course, so fire, this idea of the immanence of this fire energy, this spiritual energy that is often seen or symbolized as fire or flame. So spirit is immanent in the world. There's the idea of born again, which again, Pisces as gestation is part of that. And also this question, do we have to return to the womb? Do we have to go back to Pisces? Can we not move forward into Aries? Are we not allowed? And that's a question that Percival had. Obviously, of the three stories, this one comes first. Nicodemus would be the oldest story, and then Beowulf would be next, and Fisher King would be the most recent. The 12th century one is the most recent one I picked. And so, Can we return to the womb? Can we never leave Pisces into Aries? And Jesus's answer is you have to be born of water and the spirit, of water and fire. And again, Pisces, Aries cusp. But, and I think this is a lot of the symbolism that we're exploring, is like, do you delve right back into the same cycle? Is it a circle or is it a corkscrew? Is it a circle or a spiral? Do you delve back straight into the same thing that Aries meant for you last time? Or is there an evolution to it? And there will, believe me, there will be repeats where you don't evolve and you go right back into it again. But hopefully there is, even if you repeat it almost time for time, you know, experience for experience, there's still going to be some wisdom or some deeper understanding that you can bring to working through any kind of cycle. So you have to be born of water, Pisces, and spirit, fire, Aries, that Pisces, Aries cusp, but perhaps a new level this time, higher up on that spiraling corkscrew. Not perish, but have everlasting life. That's the boundless Piscean energy as eternity. In fact, the word, very fascinatingly, the word for heaven in Hebrew is Shemayim, and Mayim is Mem is water, Mayim is kind of the plural of that, I think, like waters or seas. I-am is a plural ending. And so Mayim are the seas, the oceans. Mayim is heaven. Is Shin, which is the judgment card, which is fire and water. Mayim, fire, water, heaven. And so the idea of born of spirit and fire, of water and spirit, of water and fire, and this fascinating, you know, and I'm barely Christian. I am not Jewish. Do not take any religious instruction from me at all, ever, but I do love symbolism, and so I think that is very fascinating, that this combination of this fiery water, you know, level is somehow, that is what heaven is all about. And it's also the word not just for heaven but also for sky. And probably, I don't know if it's more commonly sky or not. I don't know. Not actually speaking Hebrew. So not perish, but everlasting life, boundless Pisces as eternity. Not to condemn, but to save, the two sides of the Aries warrior. There's the vengeful one, but there's also the protective one. And I think this is where I'm going to get a little preachy in terms of, as I meditated on these stories and the violence in them, and you know, and I'm pretty peace out, man. You know, I don't particularly care for violence at all. However, it has a place, and we need to be aware of that. And that's a very, very difficult thing to come to terms with, because you don't ever learn anything without swinging out of control with it. Everything's a pendulum, and to learn anything, you end up swinging out of control with it. And the protection of the warrior is absolutely essential to any individual, to any family, to any culture, to any tribe, to any nation. The idea of protecting is essential, but vengeance is not. And that's, to me, is the heart of this transit and what we can learn from it. And then the final conclusion of that story coming into light is Aries, coming into the alchemical gold, perhaps. I mean, gold is the sun, which rules Leo, and that's the end in my explanation of the Thema Mundi and how it applies to alchemy, which I got from, I did not make that up. I got it from Titus Burkhart's book on alchemy, but it's in that most recent blog post that I have on calcination. The idea of coming into the light is that conclusion of the alchemical process and the arriving at the sun and Leo. However, it's very interesting to note that the sun is exalted in Aries. And so there might be, even at that Mars level, there might be a preview of some of that alchemical gold. So here's our final conclusion, and I was very Socratic and did not tell you anything. Hopefully, I just did my soapbox is what I just concluded, and so the conclusion itself is: what does it mean to you to move from Pisces into Aries? What does it mean to you for Saturn and Neptune to join at 0 degrees of Aries? What does it mean for you? What does it mean for the world? And of course, I'll give us a chance to talk and have some final discussion here. But I do want to thank you for attending Stories on Stars. I hope that you found it interesting and that it stirred up some ideas for you. You can visit my website, joyvernon.com, for information, classes, to schedule a reading. My blog, you can find linked on my website, obviously. That's how most people have it, but you can also go to completelyjoyous.com and get there. We've got tons of stuff going on at the Greater Seattle Tarot Meetup until I burn out. We'll see. But right now I'm doing 3 meetups a month. So please come and enjoy them while they're there. You can find me on Joy Vernon Astrology Tarot Reiki on YouTube, and there are lots of these old meetups that I have edited and put there. And always, always thank you. Much thanks and gratitude for coming, for showing up, for participating. This, to me, this is what I do for fun. This is what I love doing. So I love meeting with you guys, and I love our discussions, and I love sharing my crazy ideas with you, and hearing your crazy ideas too. If you do want to send a donation, you're welcome to do so via PayPal, and just use my I don't know how it works, but you can use my email address, joy@joyvernon.com. Thank you so much. Okay, so our third story, Nicodemus. What do you guys think? Is anybody a recovering Christian that had a tremor when I when I brought it up? Amazing class, so many different ideas and associations. Cool.
So one of the things that the Nicodemus story cleared up for me a lot was that the whole transition from Pisces to Aries, it's all about what Nicodemus asks him. He says, to be reborn, must it be through the womb? What he's saying is to be enlightened, to be reborn, does that mean I'm going to be reincarnated? Being born again from the mother's womb? And I thought about that, and I thought, in terms of this transitional period between Pisces and Aries, that's kind of a birth thing, because you have water and blood, by fire being the blood, being Aries, that whole thing. And that's the time when spring comes. That's the whole thing about spring. And so I thought that's the whole rebirth thing. So it all ties together, whether we're talking about the individual being poor old Nicodemus trying to figure out, because he's an old guy and he's not getting it yet. He sees Jesus and thinks, he's really cool. He's my guru now. And so he goes for it, but he realizes he's not going to be Jesus this lifetime. So he asks me, do I have to be born again? Is this going to work out for me? And I think because I think at the time, especially there's evidence that the early Christians and Jesus himself had this whole concept of reincarnation. Don't know. But anyway, so I kind of like that in terms of the whole presentation about Saturn and what's his name? The
Neptune.
Pisces. Neptune, yeah. The Pisces. So it's kind of that whole rubric. They said all tied together for me very nicely. It was like I was right. It was like People magazine, but no Brad Pitt.
Well, there's a oblique reference to Angelina Jolie because she was in Beowulf. She played the mother in Beowulf in the movie.
All right, now I'm going to watch it on Netflix.
Oh yeah, you got to watch that one for sure. Any other thoughts? Any other questions? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, I see this comparison between fire and water, being baptized of fire and water as basically the development of the ability to surrender as well as the ability to assert one's individuality, willpower. So I see that you need both. You need to be able to surrender but not lose yourself, and to exercise the self. That's what I see.
Oh, I really like that, because that's what Jesus's answer was to Nicodemus's question. No, you don't have to be reborn again. You can do it right now. Because Jesus was always saying that. He's always, that's one of his things is right now.
And hopefully, again, I tried to, even though I don't have like a specific exercise for you to do or tarot spread or anything like that, I did really hope to trigger things by asking after each story, what does this mean to you? And jot your ideas down. And what I would encourage you to do if you want to continue to work with this symbolism is know what were my favorite symbols in Beowulf, or the things that I need more info on, or that I want to invoke in my life or want to heal in my life. Same thing with each story, with Fisher King, with Nicodemus. What was resonating? What do I want to work with? What do I need to heal? Whatever, jot those things down and maybe pull some cards on those questions. And how can I work with this? How can I invoke this into my life? How can I heal this in my life? It's just a free form exercise. But if you want to continue working with the symbolism, I would encourage something like that. Thank you so much. Yeah. This is fun. I love doing this.